Two women are shot and killed at Texas A&M University Commerce. Police have identified them as sisters from Garland, Deja Matz and Aboney Matz. Aboney's 2-year-old son was also injured in
February 3, 2020, Texas A&M University Commerce. A freshman dorm called Pride Rock Hall. A 19-year-old studying to be a nurse. Her 20-year-old sister visiting for the night. A 2-year-old boy who just wanted to spend time with his mama and his auntie. By 10:17 that morning, 2 of them would be gone. The toddler would be wounded but alive. And the man responsible? He had been arrested for attacking one of those women with a frying pan and threatening her with a knife just 6 days earlier. The court released him anyway. The university gave her a key card to stay in her sister's dorm anyway. And he used that same key card to walk right through the front door. Now, I need you to understand something. This case isn't just about one violent man. It's about every single system that was supposed to protect these sisters, and how every single one of them failed. Welcome to Unseen Stories. I'm your host, and today we're covering a case that's going to make you question everything about campus security, domestic violence protection, and how our justice system handles dangerous people. This is the story of Deja and Aboney Matz, 2 sisters from Garland, Texas. And I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, how it could have been prevented, and why their deaths represent failures at every level. Now, before we get into the details, I want to be clear about something. This story is heavy. It involves violence. It involves a child who was present during a traumatic event. But we're going to handle this with respect for the victims and their family, while also being honest about what went wrong. Because that's the only way we learn. That's the only way we do better. Let's start with who these young women were. Because they deserve to be remembered as more than just victims. Deja Matz was 19 years old in February 2020, a freshman at Texas A&M University Commerce. And she wasn't just going to college because that's what you do after high school. She had a purpose, public health major, future nurse. She wanted to help people, wanted to heal people. And that choice, it wasn't random. Her mother, Vanessa Calderon, worked in dentistry. So Deja grew up watching her mama help people, care for people. She was following that example. Building on it. Her father, Timothy Matz, would later describe both his daughters this way.
I think it was like a coward move. I mean, that somebody would do something like that, you know what I'm saying? My daughters were fun, uplifting, had plenty of friends, nice folks, you know what I'm saying? They took both of my daughters.
That's what Deja was. Friends said she was focused, determined. The type of student who didn't just show up to class, she came prepared. Questions ready. Notes organized. Textbooks highlighted in different colors. She was serious about her education, serious about her future. And she was building that future in Commerce, Texas. Small college town. The kind of place where thousands of students walk to class every day believing they're safe. Believing the dorms are secure. Believing that campus is a protected space. Deja believed that too. Aboney Matz was 20 years old. She wasn't enrolled at the university, but that doesn't mean she lacked ambition. That doesn't mean she wasn't working towards something. She was a mother. A young mother to a 2-year-old son. And if you know anything about being a parent, especially a young parent, you know that's a full-time job by itself. But Aboney was doing more than just surviving. She was building. Working toward stability. Working toward a career in medicine just like her sister. Trying to create a better life for her son. Her father would later say this about the bond between his daughters. I don't think Deja would have had it another way to leave here with her sister. That's the kind of relationship they had. Not just siblings. Best friends. The type of sisters who finished each other's sentences. Who borrowed each other's clothes without asking. Who fought and made up 5 minutes later. They supported each other through everything. Through Aboney becoming a mother at 18. Through Deja starting college. Through the ups and downs that come with being young and figuring life out. And in those family photos that the news would later show, you can see it. The way Aboney looked at her son. That fierce, protective love. She wasn't just raising a child. She was raising a good man. Teaching him kindness in a world that hadn't always shown her kindness. The Matz family was tight. Vanessa and Timothy raised their daughters in Garland, Texas. Education mattered in that household. Family came first. They celebrated achievements. They showed up for school events. They were the type of parents who didn't just ask how was school, they sat down and helped with homework. When Aboney became a mother young, there was no judgment. Just support. Grandparents stepped in. Deja became the world's most devoted auntie, spoiling that little boy with books and toys, reading to him before bed when she came home from college. That weekend before everything happened, the family had gathered in Garland for a birthday party. Deja and Aboney's brother was celebrating. The house was full of laughter. Photos were taken. Food was shared. Nobody knew those were going to be the last memories. Sunday night, February 2nd, 2020. The party was over. Deja needed to get back to campus. She had classes Monday morning, and she was the type of student who didn't miss lectures. So Aboney, being the protective older sister she was, packed her 2-year-old son into the car and drove Deja back to Commerce. Timothy Matz would later explain what happened next. They took her back Sunday night, and it was too late for her to come back this way. So she spent the night down there, and this happened. Both of my daughters. Look at that decision for a second. Not with hindsight, but with the information Aboney had at that moment. It was late. The drive back to Garland would take time. She had her toddler with her. Deja had a dorm room. The university allowed overnight guests. They even had a system for it. Temporary key cards for visitors. It was a normal decision. The kind families make every single day. Aboney probably figured they'd stay up late talking. Maybe Deja would show her around campus. Introduce her to some friends. They'd put the little one to bed and just spend time together. Then in the morning, Aboney would head back to Garland. Deja would go to class. Life would continue. That's not what happened. But before we get to February 3rd, before we talk about what happened in room 116 of Pride Rock Dormitory, we need to talk about Jacques Deshawn Smith. Because this story doesn't start on that Monday morning. It starts weeks before, months before, years before. Jacques Smith was 21 years old in February 2020, and by that point he had already built a documented history of violence. This wasn't his first time in the system. This wasn't some guy who just snapped one day. The pattern was already there, clear as day. He was Aboney's ex-boyfriend, and their relationship? It had been marked by the kind of escalating control and violence that domestic violence experts recognize immediately. The relationship had ended. Aboney had moved on. Or at least she was trying to move on. But Jacques hadn't accepted that reality. Instead of respecting her decision, instead of moving forward with his own life, he continued to pursue her, harass her. And that harassment had already turned physical. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something important. Because a lot of people hear domestic violence and they think it's just relationship drama. Arguments that got out of hand. Two people who couldn't get along. That's not what domestic violence is. Domestic violence is about power. It's about control. It's about one person deciding that another person doesn't have the right to make their own choices, doesn't have the right to leave, doesn't have the right to say no. And the most dangerous time for a victim? It's not while they're in the relationship. It's when they try to leave, or right after they've left. That's when abusers escalate, because they're losing control, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it back. Aboney was in that window. That dangerous window, and the system knew it. 1 week before what happened at that dorm. 6 days to be exact. Garland, Texas. Aboney was trying to end things with Jacques permanently. And his response? Rage. He grabbed a frying pan, a regular kitchen item, and he used it as a weapon. Beat her with it. When that wasn't enough, he grabbed a lamp. Continued the attack. Aboney would later report injuries to her head and to her eyes. But Jacques wasn't finished. As she tried to escape, he pulled out a knife. Made threats. The kind of threats that make it clear if I can't have you, nobody will. Somehow Aboney got away. And she did everything right. Everything. She went to the Garland police. She reported what happened. She documented her injuries. She told them about the threats. About the knife. About the fear she was living with. And the system responded. Jacques was arrested. Charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. For a moment, Aboney could breathe. Her attacker was in custody. She was safe. Her son was safe. She even got an emergency protective order. That piece of paper that's supposed to keep an abuser away from their victim. Everything looked like it was working. But here's where everything falls apart. January 29, 2020. 2 days after the attack. 2 days after Jacques beat Aboney with a frying pan and threatened her with a knife. A judge or magistrate looked at this case. Looked at the charges, allegedly looked at Jacques Smith's criminal history, and set his bond at $15,000. Let me say that again. $15,000. That's what the court decided was appropriate. That's what they determined would ensure public safety and make sure Jacques showed up for trial. Now, here's what that judge had in front of them, or should have had in front of them. Jacques Smith had a criminal history going back to 2016. Robbery charges. Theft. Evading arrest. A legal expert would later explain that in April 2016, Smith reportedly pleaded guilty to participating in a robbery, but the charge was reduced and he was sentenced to 5 years deferred adjudication. Then in January 2018, Smith was allegedly sentenced in connection to another robbery to 5 years of community supervision. That means in January 2020, when he was arrested for attacking Aboney, he was likely already in violation of his probation. But reportedly the judge didn't know that. The systems didn't communicate. Information that should have been right there in the file somehow didn't make it to the person making the bond decision. So they set it at $15,000. Jacques posted bond. And on January 29th he walked out of that jail. 5 days later, Deja and Aboney Matz would be gone. Now I want to ask you something. And I'm asking this genuinely. What is the purpose of a bond in a case like this? The bond system exists for 2 reasons. 1, to make sure defendants show up for trial. 2, to protect public safety while the case is pending. In Jacques Smith's case, you had a man with a history of violence. A recent, documented attack involving multiple weapons. A victim who had obtained a protective order because she feared for her safety. What amount of money makes that situation safe? What dollar amount ensures that a man who beat a woman with a frying pan, threatened her with a knife, and had a history of not following court orders, won't go after her again? I'll tell you the answer. There isn't one. Some people shouldn't be released on bond. Period. Not because they don't have rights. Not because they're not entitled to due process. But because the risk to public safety is too high. Jacques Smith was one of those people. And somebody, somewhere in that system should have recognized that. They didn't. Aboney had that protective order. That document that said Jacques had to stay away from her. Couldn't contact her. Couldn't go near her home or workplace. Standard language. Looks official. Comes with stern warnings about what happens if you violate it. But here's the reality about protective orders, and this is something we need to be honest about. They're pieces of paper. They work when the person they're issued against respects the law. When they're afraid of consequences. When they value their freedom enough to follow the rules. But for someone who's already decided they don't care about the law? Someone who's already proven they're willing to use violence? Someone who's already violated probation and committed new offenses? That protective order means nothing. It's a speed limit sign to someone who's already decided they're going to drive recklessly. And Aboney knew that. Women in her situation always know that. They get the protective order because it's what you're supposed to do. Because maybe it'll help. Because it's better than nothing. But they also know that if their abuser decides to come after them, that paper won't stop him. The question is, what else is supposed to stop him? Where's the enforcement? Where's the monitoring? Where's the system that checks on victims of domestic violence who have active protective orders and makes sure they're still safe? For Aboney, that system didn't exist. 4 or 5 days after Jacques was released, she lived her life. Took care of her son. Stayed in touch with her sister. Made plans. She had no way of knowing that Jacques was planning something. And she had no reason to believe that visiting her sister on a college campus, in a secure dormitory, would put her in danger. Why would she? Dorms are supposed to be safe. They have key card access, security protocols, controlled entry points, right? Let's talk about Texas A&M University Commerce for a minute, and specifically Pride Rock Hall. This was a freshman dormitory, co-ed, suite-style rooms. The kind of place where thousands of students lived every semester, where parents dropped off their kids believing they were in one of the safest environments possible. The university had security measures in place. They had to. You can't run a residence hall in 2020 without some kind of access control. Pride Rock used key card entry. You needed a card to get in the main entrance. Needed a card to use the elevator. Needed a card to access individual rooms. The system was designed to keep unauthorized people out while giving residents and their approved guests convenient access. And the university had a policy for overnight visitors. Because of course they did. Students have family, have friends from home, have people who visit for the weekend or stay overnight for various reasons. So when Aboney decided to stay in Deja's dorm room that Sunday night, she followed the proper procedure. She was issued a temporary key card for her overnight stay. Everything by the book. Everything according to policy. Everything that should have kept her safe. Except there was a massive hole in that security system. A vulnerability that nobody seemed to have considered. What happens when that key card ends up in the wrong hands? Monday morning, February 3rd. Across the Texas A&M Commerce campus, students were waking up for class, grabbing coffee, checking their phones, living that regular college life. In room 116 of Pride Rock Hall, maybe Deja was getting ready for her public health lecture. Maybe Aboney was helping her nephew get dressed, planning to grab breakfast before heading back to Garland. We don't know exactly what those final normal moments looked like. What we do know is that at approximately 10:17 a.m. normal ended. Gunshots. Multiple gunshots inside Pride Rock dormitory. Sure. Loud. Unmistakable. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a place of learning. The kind of sound that sends people diving for cover. In the room next door, a student was just returning to her dorm. She walked in and noticed something strange. It looked like part of the ceiling had fallen onto her floor and desk. Then she saw the hole in her wall. She called 911.
And there's a hole through my wall, and on the other side directly across, there's a nick in my calendar. So it looks like something was shot through the wall and hit my calendar.
While she was on that call, while she was calmly trying to figure out what happened, 2 young women were already gone on the other side of that wall. And a 2-year-old boy was wounded but alive. 10:17 a.m. University Police Department sent out the emergency notification. Text messages. Emails. Campus alerts hitting thousands of phones all at once. Students across campus received this message. UPD is actively investigating a situation at Pride Rock. The campus is under shelter-in-place orders. Avoid the area until further notice. For students at Texas A&M Commerce, this wasn't their first time receiving that kind of alert. Just 3 months earlier, in October 2019, there had been a situation at an off-campus party in Greenville during homecoming weekend. 2 people were gone. A dozen injured. Hundreds of students running for their lives. Now it was happening again. On campus this time. In a freshman dorm. Student Esma Galvin would later describe the feeling. She told reporters it felt unsettling, like this is not supposed to happen here.
Just chilling, it's like this is not supposed to happen here.
Esma Galvan saw police outside Pride Rock Residence Hall as alerts appeared on her phone.
Shelter in place, shelter in place, shelter in place.
Texas A&M Commerce police say a student living in the dorms called them just after 10 this morning. Officers arrived to find the women dead and a toddler believed to be about 2 years old
Larry
injured.
Cooper III was in his room when it happened. I was in my room and I heard like 3 gunshots. At first I thought it was just a balloon popping or something, but then I kept hearing it, so I looked outside. What he saw was chaos. Students running. Campus police arriving with weapons drawn. Fear on every single face. The university went into full lockdown mode. Campus police. Local sheriff's deputies. State investigators. Everyone converging on Pride Rock Hall. Emergency vehicles line the streets. Paramedics standing by. News helicopters starting to circle overhead. 4 hours, students huddled in place. Not knowing if the person responsible was still in the building. Not knowing if they were safe. Not knowing if someone they knew was hurt. Parents were calling the university. Flooding the lines. Desperate for information about their children. Social media was filling up with rumors. Speculation. Fear feeding on uncertainty. And inside room 116, investigators were processing a scene that would stay with them. 2 young women. Both with multiple gunshot wounds. Both deceased. 19-year-old Deja Matz. 20-year-old Aboney Matz. Sisters who had spent their last night talking, laughing, being together. Now lying in that dorm room surrounded by Deja's textbooks and photos and dreams of the future. And in that same room a 2-year-old boy. Wounded. Shot in the leg. But alive. The child was rushed to the hospital. Paramedics working on him in the ambulance. Doctors would later confirm he was in stable condition. The physical wound would heal. But that child had just witnessed something no child should ever see. That trauma? That doesn't heal the same way. University officials would later announce. Officers responded and found 2 deceased adult females in a room. The child was taken to a local hospital and is in stable condition. As investigators processed the scene, certain things became clear very quickly. This wasn't random. This wasn't a situation where someone came to campus to hurt as many people as possible. This was targeted, personal, domestic violence that had followed Aboney to a place she thought was safe. The bullet that went through the wall into the neighbor's room? That was just one of multiple shots fired. The forensics team started mapping trajectories, collecting casings, documenting blood patterns. Each piece of evidence telling part of a story that made less sense the more they uncovered. Because here's what investigators couldn't understand at first. How did the person responsible get into this building? Pride Rock had key card access. You couldn't just walk in off the street. You needed authorization. So either the person forced his way in or someone let him in and that's when they found it. The temporary key card that had been issued to Aboney for her overnight stay. That card was missing. Jacques Deshawn Smith had fled the scene, left campus, put distance between himself and what he'd just done. But he didn't disappear entirely. In fact, hours after what happened, while police were still processing the scene, while students were still in lockdown, while a family was receiving the worst news possible, Jacques posted on Facebook. Not a confession. Not an apology. He wrote to someone named Abby, likely Aboney. He wrote expressing disbelief about what had happened, saying he was waiting for her call to tell him it's all a lie. He wrote about his affection for her and for Bunka, possibly the nickname for Aboney's son, said they meant everything to him. He mentioned wishing they weren't going through difficulties, claimed he would have protected them, said they would have had to get me first. Read that again. The man who had just done this was posting on social media claiming he would have protected them. A law enforcement source would later say, that Facebook post was actually what helped lead to his arrest. It showed consciousness of guilt. He knew exactly what he'd done. By the evening of February 3rd, police had a warrant for Jacques Smith's arrest. Capital murder. By February 4th, a multi-agency task force had tracked him to a residence in Rowlett, Texas. Authorities surrounded the house. And Jacques, who had shown so much when confronting unarmed women and a toddler, surrendered without incident when faced with armed officers. He was taken into custody, booked into Hunt County Detention Center, charged with capital murder of multiple persons, the most serious criminal charge available under Texas law, the kind of charge that carries the possibility of the most severe penalties. But his arrest didn't bring Deja and Aboney back, didn't heal their nephew's injuries or erase his trauma, didn't give their family any peace, and it didn't answer the most important question. How did this happen? As investigators reviewed security footage and interviewed witnesses, the full picture started to come together. Jacques Smith had obtained Aboney's temporary key card, the same card the university had issued to her for her overnight stay in Deja's dorm. Whether he took it by force, whether she had it somewhere he could access it, whether he manipulated her into giving it to him, those details aren't entirely clear. What is clear is this. He used that card to enter Pride Rock Dormitory. Walked right through the front door. The same security system that was supposed to protect students had let him in. He used it to access the elevator. He used it to get to Deja's floor. And he made his way to room 116. The university's security system, the key cards, the controlled access, the guest registration process, none of it mattered. Because the system had a fundamental flaw that nobody had addressed. What happens when access credentials end up in the wrong hands? Security consultant Michael Dorn would later explain. We design systems to control access, but we don't always account for human factors. Let me break that down in plain language. The university built a system that worked perfectly if everyone using it had good intentions. If visitors were actually just visiting. If temporary key cards were only used by the people they were issued to. But what about when a violent criminal gets hold of one? What's the backup plan then? Where's the monitoring? Where's the flag that gets raised when someone with an active protective order against them might have access to a secure building? Those systems didn't exist. And the result was 2 sisters gone and a traumatized child. The lockdown at Texas A&M Commerce lasted for hours. When it finally lifted around 1:30 p.m., students emerged to find their campus transformed. Yellow crime scene tape everywhere. Police vehicles lining the streets. News crews setting up. Helicopters overhead. Pride Rock Dormitory was completely sealed off. Students who lived there couldn't get back to their rooms. Some didn't want to. Student Jalen Black told reporters, "I don't feel safe on campus. How can someone just come into a dorm and shoot people?" That question hung in the air, because it was the question everyone was asking. How did this happen? The university announced classes would be canceled the following day. Counseling services were made available for traumatized students. A vigil was organized. But for the people who lived in Pride Rock, for the students who had heard those gunshots, for the young woman who called 911 about a hole in her wall, no amount of counseling sessions or candle lighting was going to make them feel safe again. Student Jordan Polk put it this way: "You didn't have to be there to be traumatized." And that's the truth about violence like this. It doesn't just affect the direct victims. It ripples out, touches everyone in the community. Students who had nothing to do with this case, who didn't know Deja or Aboney, who weren't even in Pride Rock that day, still felt it, still carried it. Because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. While students were processing trauma, while the university was managing crisis communications, while the media was covering the story, Timothy Matz and Vanessa Calderon were living every parent's worst nightmare. Timothy would later say, "I just dropped to my knees." How do you process losing both your daughters at once? How do you process that? One moment your daughters are alive. You saw them yesterday at the birthday party, hugged them, took photos, made plans to see them again soon. The next moment they're gone. Both of them. Together. And your grandson, who's just 2 years old, is in the hospital with a gunshot wound. Without his mother now. Because she's gone. The family rushed to the hospital to be with the child. To hold him. To try to provide some comfort while he was recovering from physical injuries and psychological trauma no toddler should ever experience. Vanessa Calderon would later talk about her daughters. "My daughters they were both amazing go-getters. Amazing go-getters. Deja, who wanted to be a nurse. Who was the first in her family to attend college. Who highlighted her textbooks in different colors and kept organized notes. Aboney, who was building a life for her son. Who was working toward her own career in medicine. Who loved her baby with that fierce, protective love that defines motherhood. Both gone. And for what? Because a man couldn't accept that a relationship was over. Because he felt entitled to control and ownership over someone else's life. Because he chose violence when he couldn't have his way. Timothy Matz said something that captures the only possible comfort in an impossible situation. "I don't think Deja would have had it another way to leave here with her sister. At least they were together. At least neither of them was alone. At least they had each other in those final moments. It's the thinnest comfort imaginable. But when you've lost everything, you hold on to whatever you can." The family wanted the community to see video of the little boy, to understand the cruelty of what had been done. Timothy Matz spoke to reporters. "I think it was like a coward move. Someone would do something like that. My daughters had plenty of friends, nice folks. They took both of my daughters. Both of his daughters. Gone in the same place at the same time by the same person. A person who should have been in jail. A person who should never have been able to access that dormitory. A person who had shown exactly who he was through his actions, and who the system released anyway." As the shock started to wear off, as the immediate crisis response shifted into investigation and analysis, people started asking harder questions. Not just how did this happen, but how was this allowed to happen? Because the more you look at this case, the clearer it becomes. This tragedy was preventable. Not theoretically preventable. Actually, practically, obviously preventable. Let's count the failures. And I mean really count them. Failure 1. The bond decision. When Jacques Smith was arrested on January 27 for attacking Aboney with a frying pan and threatening her with a knife, that should have been the end of his freedom. He had a history of violence. Multiple prior charges. He was reportedly in violation of probation. The attack was severe enough to cause documented injuries. And most importantly, domestic violence experts know that the period right after an arrest is the most dangerous time for victims. Abusers who get arrested often escalate. Either because they're angry about being arrested, or because they realize they're losing control, or because they decide if they're facing consequences anyway they might as well finish what they started. This isn't speculation. This is documented. Researched. Known. Yet someone looked at Jacques Smith's case and said $15,000 was an appropriate bond. A legal expert would later point out, the judge doesn't always have the full picture when setting bond amounts, but we now know the full picture. That decision gave him the opportunity. 5 days of freedom between his release and what happened. 5 days to plan, to obsess, to locate Aboney, to figure out how to get to her. If he'd been held without bond, or if the bond had been set high enough that he couldn't post it, he would have been in jail on February 3rd. Deja and Aboney would still be alive. Failure 2. The protective order without enforcement. Aboney had an emergency protective order against Jacques. That order said he couldn't contact her, couldn't come near her, had to stay away. But who was enforcing that order? Who was checking to make sure Jacques was complying? Who was monitoring Aboney's safety? The answer: nobody. Protective orders are issued all the time, thousands of them across this country every year, and they're treated like the job is done once the paper is signed. But a protective order without enforcement is just a suggestion. It only works if the person it's issued against cares about following it. And violent offenders who've already shown they don't respect the law? They're not going to be deterred by a court order. There should have been check-ins. Regular contact with Aboney to make sure she was safe. Monitoring of Jacques to make sure he wasn't violating the order. None of that happened. Failure 3. The information sharing gap. The courts knew Jacques had been arrested for domestic violence. The university knew Aboney was staying on campus. Campus security knew there was a guest in Pride Rock dormitory. But these systems didn't talk to each other. Nobody at the university knew that one of their students' guests had an active protective order against a violent ex-boyfriend who had just been released from jail. Nobody flagged that as a potential security concern. Nobody thought to ask, should we have additional security measures in place? Should we alert campus police? Should we make sure this visitor is safe? Modern threat assessment protocols exist specifically to prevent these communication breakdowns. When someone poses a credible threat to specific people in specific locations, that information should trigger protective measures. Warning systems should activate. Security should be enhanced. Potential victims should be alerted. None of that happened here. Failure 4. The key card vulnerability. Even with all the other failures, the security system at Pride Rock should have been the final barrier. Jacques shouldn't have been able to just walk into that building. But the temporary key card system had a massive vulnerability. Once a card was issued, it worked for whoever held it. There was no photo ID check. No verification that the person using the card was actually the person it was issued to. And apparently, there was no way to quickly deactivate a card if it was lost or stolen or ended up in dangerous hands. So when Jacques got hold of Aboney's card, whether through theft or force or deception, he had unrestricted access to that building. He could come and go as he pleased. And nobody knew until it was too late. Timothy Matz would later ask a question that cut to the heart of this failure. Where was security when all of this was going on? It's a question that still doesn't have a good answer. Here's what I want you to understand about this case. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't unforeseeable. This wasn't one of those tragedies where we look back and say there was no way to know. Every single warning sign was there. A violent man with a criminal history. A recent, serious attack. An active protective order. A victim who had reported the violence and sought help. The system had all the information it needed to protect Deja and Aboney. It just didn't use it. And that's what should concern us. Not just make us sad, but make us demand change. Because how many other women are out there right now in Aboney's situation? How many have protective orders that aren't being enforced? How many dangerous people are being released on low bonds while their victims live in fear? How many campuses have the same security vulnerabilities that Pride Rock had? These aren't just questions to think about. These are questions that demand answers and action. Jacques Deshawn Smith was charged with capital murder of multiple persons. In Texas, that charge carries 2 possible outcomes. The most severe penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case against him was strong. Physical evidence, witness testimony, his own social media posts, his documented history of violence against Aboney. But criminal charges against the perpetrator, while necessary, weren't enough for the Matz family. They wanted accountability from the institutions that had failed to protect their daughters. They wanted answers from Texas A&M University Commerce about the security protocols that allowed a violent criminal to access a supposedly secure dormitory. They wanted to understand why the university had issued a temporary key card without any safeguards to prevent it from being used by someone other than the person it was issued to. They wanted transparency about what steps the university was taking to prevent similar breaches in the future. These weren't unreasonable requests. These were essential questions about institutional accountability and student safety. But according to reports, the university response was limited. They issued statements expressing condolence. They said they were reviewing security procedures. But meaningful changes? Actual reforms to prevent this from happening again? Those came slowly, if at all. Students returning to campus didn't feel safer. Student Jalen Black noted, "They put up some signs and said they'd have more security, but I still don't feel safe. How do we know this won't happen again?" And that's a fair question. Because without addressing the fundamental vulnerabilities, without changing the policies that failed, without implementing actual security improvements, it could happen again. I want to take a moment to step back from the specific details of this case and talk about what it reveals. Because Deja and Aboney's story isn't unique in its broad outlines. Domestic violence situations that escalate happen far too often in this country. Women are harmed by current or former intimate partners at alarming rates. What makes this case stand out is the setting. A college campus, a place specifically designed to be safe for young people, and the multiple cascading system failures that allowed violence to penetrate that supposedly safe space. So what do we learn? Lesson 1. Protective orders need enforcement. We need to be honest about the limitations of protective orders. They're an important tool. They create legal consequences for violations. They document the threat. They're often the first step in a victim seeking help, but they're not protection by themselves. A piece of paper doesn't stop violence. It doesn't stop someone who's already decided they're willing to break the law. Real protection requires enforcement, monitoring, check-ins with victims to ensure safety, consequences for violations that are swift and certain. And in high-risk cases, like someone who's just been arrested for violent assault with weapons, protective orders need to be coupled with detention. Some people are too dangerous to be out on the streets, regardless of bond amount. Lesson 2. Bond decisions must consider victim safety. The purpose of the bond system isn't just to ensure defendants show up for trial. It's also to protect public safety while cases are pending. In domestic violence cases, that means seriously evaluating the risk to victims. Someone with Jacques Smith's history facing charges for a violent attack with weapons against a victim who had already sought a protective order, that person presents a clear and present danger. The bond should reflect that danger. And in many cases, the answer should be no bond at all. We need judges and magistrates who understand domestic violence dynamics, who know the statistics about escalation, who take victim safety seriously when making these decisions. Lesson 3. Institutions must communicate. The courts knew about Jacques' arrest and release. The university knew about Aboney's visit to campus. But those two pieces of information never came together until it was too late. We need better systems for threat assessment and information sharing. When someone with an active protective order is going to be in a specific location, especially a location with vulnerable populations like a college campus, that information should be shared with security. Not to violate anyone's privacy. Not to discriminate against victims of domestic violence. But to allow for appropriate protective measures. Enhanced security presence. Alert staff. Plans in place in case the abuser shows up. Lesson 4. Campus security must address real threats. College campuses spend millions on security systems. Keycard access, cameras, campus police, emergency alert systems. But those systems are often designed for theoretical threats rather than real ones. The reality is that the most common threats to campus safety aren't stranger danger or random violence. They're domestic violence situations, assaults by acquaintances, conflicts between people who know each other. Security systems need to account for that reality. That means not just controlling who has access cards, but monitoring how those cards are used. Flagging unusual patterns. Having protocols for when cards are reported lost or stolen. It means training campus security and resident advisors to recognize signs of domestic violence and stalking. It means having clear procedures for when a student or guest is at elevated risk. Lesson 5. We all have a role to play. This case involved failures at the institutional level. Courts, universities, law enforcement. But it also raises questions about what we as individuals can do. If you know someone in an abusive relationship, don't wait for them to ask for help. Offer resources. Let them know you're there. Be persistent, because leaving an abusive relationship often takes multiple attempts. If you work in student housing or campus security, take domestic violence threats seriously. Advocate for better policies. Push for security measures that address real risks. And if you're in an abusive relationship yourself, know this. It's not your fault. You deserve to be safe. And there are people who can help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. They can connect you with local resources, help you make a safety plan, and provide support. You don't have to go through this alone. I want to bring this back to the two women at the center of this story. Because in all the discussion about system failures and security protocols and legal proceedings, we can't forget who they were. Deja Matz was 19 years old. She wanted to be a nurse. She was the first in her family to go to college. She was serious about her education and her future. She chose public health because she wanted to help people, wanted to protect and improve lives. Her passing, along with her sisters, should motivate all of us to examine the systems that failed them and work to ensure other families don't experience similar losses. Aboney Matz was 20 years old. She was a devoted mother trying to build a better life for her son. She had dreams of working in medicine. She was building stability and security for her family. She did everything right when she found herself in a dangerous relationship. She reported the violence. She got a protective order. She sought help. The system failed her anyway. Rebecca Lopez, a reporter who covered the story, spoke with the family. She explained, "The girl's family says there had been relationship issues, but for now they want the focus to be on these two beautiful sisters who were full of life and love." That father also said to her, "Just my little booze. My booze." The pain in those words. The absolute devastation of a parent who lost both his daughters. Their father also made clear. Abney did not attend the college. She drove her sister back to school after a big family get-together over the weekend. She and baby Alan were only going to spend one night there. One night. That's all it was supposed to be. One night staying with her sister. Then back home the next morning. He continued, "'Cause they were just up here. My son had a birthday party and they was all up here and then went back and this right here happened. They were just at a birthday party, celebrating, being a family. And then this happened." The deaths of Deja and Aboney Matz represent more than a single tragedy. They reveal critical weaknesses in the systems we rely on to protect vulnerable people from violence. Every failure in this case, the bond decision, the protective order without enforcement, the lack of communication between institutions, the security vulnerability, these are failures that exist across our country. In courtrooms making bond decisions every day. On college campuses with similar security systems. In communities where domestic violence victims are trying to escape their abusers. We can do better. We must do better. That means judges taking domestic violence seriously when setting bonds. That means colleges designing security systems that address real threats, not just theoretical ones. That means law enforcement and institutions sharing information when someone's safety is at risk. That means all of us recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence and supporting victims and getting help. The Matz family can't bring their daughters back. That 2-year-old boy will grow up without his mother. The campus community at Texas A&M Commerce will carry this trauma. But we can honor Deja and Aboney's memory by learning from what happened, by fixing the systems that failed them, by ensuring that other women in dangerous relationships get the protection they need, by holding institutions accountable when they fall short, and by never accepting that tragedies like this are inevitable. They're not inevitable. They're the result of choices, policy choices, resource allocation choices, priority choices, and if we make different choices, we can prevent these outcomes. Deja wanted to spend her life protecting others through public health. Aboney wanted to build a safe, stable life for her son. Neither of them got to fulfill those dreams. But we can fulfill them in their memory by building the safer world they deserve to live in. When I look at this case, what stays with me isn't just the violence. It's the missed opportunities. 5 days. That's how long Jacques Smith was free between his arrest and what he did. 5 days where he should have been in jail. 5 days where Aboney should have been safe. 5 days that could have changed everything. And that key card. That simple piece of plastic that was supposed to make campus life more convenient. Instead, it became the tool that allowed a violent man to access a secure building and destroy 2 lives. How many other campuses have the same vulnerability right now? How many other students are living in dorms with keycard systems that have never been tested against a determined, dangerous person? These are the questions we need to be asking. These are the conversations we need to be having. Not just when tragedy strikes, not just when it makes the news, but right now, today, before the next Deja and Aboney. To everyone watching this, I want you to take something away from this story. If you're in college, talk to your campus security about their policies. Ask about keycard protocols. Ask what happens if a card is lost or stolen. Ask how they handle domestic violence threats. If you're a parent with a child in college, have those conversations too. Make sure your student knows the resources available if they or someone they know is in danger. If you work in higher education, push for better security measures. Push for better training. Push for policies that address the real threats students face. If you're in the legal system, remember that bond decisions have life and death consequences. That protective orders without enforcement are worthless. That victim safety must be the priority. And if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline. 1-800-799-7233. Available 24/7. If you're in immediate danger, call 911. There is help available. There are people who care. There are ways out. You don't have to stay in a dangerous situation. You don't have to face this alone. Rest in peace, Deja Matz. Rest in peace, Aboney Matz. Your lives mattered. Your dreams mattered. Your family's pain matters. And what happened to you will not be forgotten. We'll remember you as the sisters you were. Best friends. Amazing go-getters. Women with futures that were stolen too soon. We'll remember that you did everything right, Aboney. You reported the violence. You got the protective order. You sought safety. And we'll remember that the systems that were supposed to protect you failed. Because remembering is the first step toward change. And change is what we owe you. This has been Unseen Stories. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring enough to learn about this case. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you want to see change, share it. Talk about it. Use your voice to demand better from the institutions that are supposed to keep us safe. Because awareness is the first step toward change. And change is what we owe to victims like Deja and Aboney Matz. Until next time, stay safe. Look out for each other. And never accept that violence is inevitable. We can do better. We have to.